Welcome. Today we are going to be looking at an incredibly difficult and very sensitive case. It's the 2020 disappearance and presumed murder of a 17-year-old girl, Bernadette Walker, in Peterborough, England.
And this exploration is really centered on the facts of the case, the official records.
Yeah.
And it's also about the immense challenge for investigators in bringing a murder conviction when the victim's body has never, ever been found.
Right. It's a case where the police essentially had to build a picture of events using digital breadcrumbs, behavioral patterns, and not much else.
It's absolutely vital that we approach this with the seriousness it deserves. We're focusing only on the established facts, what was presented in court, and the meticulous police work that went into building the case.
Yeah.
Our sources detail just an immense personal tragedy, but also an extraordinary legal outcome. It really reveals the depth of the betrayal Bernadette faced.
And also how justice can sometimes be found, even without that crucial piece of traditional forensic evidence. So let's start with the core facts, just to set the stage for you. Bernadette Walker was a young photography student, born around 2002 or 2003. When she vanished in the summer of 2020, the investigation pretty quickly centered on her family.
And the outcome was, frankly, shocking. Her stepfather, Scott Walker, was convicted of her murder.
And then her own mother, Sarah Walker, was convicted of perverting the course of justice.
And through all of this, there's one profound, agonizing detail that hangs over everything. Despite massive, exhaustive searches by the police, we're talking appeals, advanced technology, everything they had, Bernadette's body has never been recovered.
And that fact alone really changes everything. It elevates this from a tragic, but perhaps more straightforward investigation into a monumental legal challenge.
It does. The prosecution had to prove everything, intent, opportunity, the fact of her death, beyond a reasonable doubt. And they had to do it using only circumstantial evidence and the defendant's own lies and disastrous attempts to cover their tracks.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole case, and we have to start at the very beginning, at the root of it all. The motive. This wasn't a random act. The sources are clear that it was triggered by something Bernadette herself did, a courageous act just days before she went missing.
Right. You have to look at the immediate context leading up to July 18th, 2020. That context really explains everything that happened next.
The sources, as you said, are unequivocal here. The motive for the murder was based on the fact that Bernadette had finally spoken up about years of torment.
She had. She made extremely serious allegations against her stepfather, Scott Walker. She claimed he'd been sexually abusing her for several years.
And the prosecution's case was built on this.
It was. They established that Scott Walker killed her for one specific reason: to prevent her pursuing her allegations of sexual abuse any further.
So this gives you that cold, calculated intent. This wasn't some moment of rage or panic.
No, it was, as the prosecution saw it, the elimination of a threat to his freedom, to his reputation, posed by the victim's testimony.
And the evidence that ties this motive directly to the time frame of her disappearance is just chilling. And it comes from Bernadette herself.
Her diary.
From her own hand, yeah. The diary entry that the police eventually recovered. And this piece of evidence, it doesn't just explain why, it paints this devastating picture of the family dynamic, of a complete failure of protection.
That diary entry is one of the most powerful and frankly, heartbreaking pieces of evidence in the whole case. It's dated July 16th.
Just 2 days before she vanished.
Only 2 days before. And, in the legal system, this kind of physical evidence, a document like a diary, it can provide the clearest window into the victim's state of mind, their claims, especially when they can no longer testify for themselves.
And the words she wrote are just, they're devastating. She wrote that she told my mom about my dad and the abuse.
And it's the reaction she documents from her mother, Sarah, that turns this cry for help into an act of profound betrayal.
What did she say her mother did?
Bernadette wrote that her mother, Sarah, called her a liar. And then, shockingly, she wrote that her mother threatened to kill me if I told the police.
So it's an active, aggressive attempt to silence her own daughter.
To protect the abuser, Scott, it signals very early on that Sarah was already prioritizing him over her own child.
And the entry ends with this just raw, poignant question.
It does. She asks, what kind of parent wouldn't believe their daughter?
And that it says everything about the emotional world she was living in.
It really does. That diary entry, while it's not direct testimony in a traditional sense, it provided the court with overwhelming evidence of motive. It proved that 2 days before her death, Bernadette was alive, she was making these allegations, and she was being actively threatened by her mother for doing so.
So it directly links her disappearance, not some teenage runaway story, but to this urgent need from both Scott and Sarah to silence her.
To silence her permanently, and then to manage the fallout. It establishes the dynamic perfectly. Scott had the motive to kill, and Sarah had already shown she was willing to conceal the truth, to cooperate.
Which brings us to the critical window of time. The day the murder is presumed to have happened, July 18th, 2020.
And this is where the investigation really pivots from motive analysis to a kind of forensic reconstruction of the day.
So what do we know for sure about that morning?
We know Bernadette was last seen when Scott Walker picked her up in his car from his parents' home in Peterborough. She'd stayed there the night before.
And from that moment on, he was the person responsible for her.
He was solely responsible for her location and her safety. And the prosecution's entire case really hung on a very specific, narrow window of time that happened right after that pickup.
The 91-minute blackout period.
Exactly.
So for you listening, why was this specific 91-minute time frame so absolutely critical for the police?
Well, because without a body, without a confession, the prosecution has to prove that the defendant had the opportunity to commit the crime, that they were isolated, without witnesses.
And that the crime fits the motive.
Right. So the digital forensics team, they established that Scott's mobile phone was deliberately switched off between 11:23 in the morning and 12:54 p.m.
A total of exactly 91 minutes.
91 minutes of no texts, no calls, no location pings, just digital silence, unrecorded movement.
91 minutes. It's a significant amount of time for sure, but how could the police be so certain that the murder happened then and not, later that day or the next morning?
The location data surrounding that blackout was the key. Digital forensics doesn't just rely on what's missing, it relies on what's present just before and just after the gap.
So they had pings from before 11:23.
Yes, they knew where he was when he picked her up. And they had the first confirmed activity right after 12:54 when the phone came back on.
And the trajectory of his travel, combined with what happened immediately after the blackout, it created this high probability that the crime was contained within that gap.
It wasn't just a gap in time, it was a carefully constructed window of maximum isolation. He created it.
So what was his explanation for those 91 minutes? He obviously couldn't say what he's really doing. He had to invent a story.
And he did. He concocted a very specific, detailed, and completely fabricated story.
Which was?
He claimed that during those 91 minutes, Bernadette had voluntarily gotten out of the car and run away. He said this happened in a place called Skater's Way in Peterborough.
He even gave a specific location.
He did. He provided coordinates, which investigators noted, 52.62075 degrees north, 0.26974 degrees west. And that specificity, that's a classic hallmark of a lie. It's an attempt to add credibility to a false story.
Trying to paint a picture of a troubled teenager just running off. So the police are faced with two completely conflicting accounts. You've got Scott's verbal story of dropping her off, and then you have the physical data that shows 91 minutes of deliberately hidden activity.
And the prosecution's view was that the phone being switched off was, in itself, proof of premeditation.
Because who does that?
Well, exactly. No responsible parent turns their phone off for over an hour right after picking up their child, especially not a child they then claim ran away just minutes later. It makes no sense.
So their conclusion was that it was during those precise 91 minutes, while he was actively hiding his movements, that he murdered Bernadette.
To silence her abuse allegations, yes.
Now, without a body, how did the police even begin to establish the method of the murder?
Well, the legal standard only required them to prove that he caused her death. But investigators did have a strong suspicion it was strangulation.
And why is that?
In cases where a body is removed from the scene, strangulation is often suspected. It's quick, it leaves very little blood or other fluid evidence, and it usually happens in close proximity, inside a vehicle.
So it fits the circumstances.
More than that, it fits the profile of the crime. A crime of power, of control, designed to literally silence a victim. Turning off the phone wasn't just about hiding a location. It was about ensuring the entire act, the murder and the immediate disposal, happened completely off the digital grid.
And that transition point, the moment the crime is committed, that leads us directly into the massive effort to conceal it, which is where Sarah's involvement really escalates.
Her complicity deepens into a criminal act.
Right. Let's move into the investigation itself and how the police started to unravel this cover-up that was orchestrated by both Scott and Sarah.
The first really glaring red flag for the police was the delay in reporting her missing. Bernadette vanished on July 18th.
But they didn't call the police until
July 21st, 3 days later.
3 days. That is an eternity in a missing person case, especially when it's a minor. What does a gap like that suggest to an investigator?
It suggests a few things: coordination, planning, and, critically, opportunity for disposal of the body.
They gave themselves time.
A 72-hour window where they could cement their false story, destroy any potential evidence, and dispose of Bernadette's body and her belongings.
And then Scott even tried to put on this public show of being a concerned stepfather.
He did. Later, in September, he shared a missing person poster on his Facebook page. But this was just calculated misdirection. It was designed to support the runaway story long after the police had already started their formal murder inquiry.
But the police, the Cambridgeshire Constabulary, they weren't buying it. They started digging into Scott's actual movements that day. And that's where his story about Skater's Way just completely fell apart.
It did. The digital and physical evidence proved he did not drive off after picking Bernadette up like he claimed.
So where did he really go?
His actual destination, which totally contradicted his story, was a lockup garage. It was owned by his parents in the Walton area of Peterborough.
And this garage became central to the case.
Absolutely critical. The sources confirm he visited this lockup several times after Bernadette was reported missing, which strongly suggests it was being used to conceal evidence, or maybe even, for a time, her remains.
So he was at this garage during, or at least around that 91-minute blackout period. It gives him an alternate criminal destination.
Yes, but the most damning behavioral evidence comes the very moment he turns his phone back on at 12:54 p.m.
The 9-minute call.
The 9-minute call. It's possibly the single most potent piece of evidence confirming a conspiracy between him and Sarah.
Because it was the very first thing he did.
The very first action he took after coming back onto the digital grid was to call Sarah. And that call lasted for over 9 minutes.
A long time.
A very long time. And police concluded, very reasonably, that the only logical reason for him to call Sarah immediately after that 91-minute window for that length of time was to tell her that he had killed Bernadette and that he needed her help in the cover-up.
That call, as the police put it, sealed their unholy alliance.
It did.
So let's focus on Sarah's actions after that call, because her conviction was for perverting the course of justice. For you listening, that's a very specific legal charge. How did her behavior fit that definition?
Perverting the course of justice is a very serious crime. It means you are deliberately obstructing or undermining a legal process, usually a police investigation. It's not just passively lying. It requires active, deceptive actions designed to mislead the authorities.
And Sarah engaged in this actively.
She did, primarily through faking communication from Bernadette.
What specifically did she do to try and maintain this fiction that Bernadette was still alive?
She tried to create a false digital trail. In her police interviews, Sarah claimed Bernadette was still sending her text messages for days after July 18th.
But she wasn't.
No. Digital forensic analysis proved that those messages were actually being sent by Sarah herself, using Bernadette's devices. She was texting her own daughter's phone, or maybe responding from it, to create a fake timeline of communication.
To give an alibi for the time after the murder.
Exactly.
And this deceit wasn't just between mother and daughter's phones. They targeted Bernadette's friends, too.
Yes, and this shows how calculated the cover-up was. They specifically tried to undermine the murder motive.
How so?
One of Bernadette's friends, a young man named Warren Naylor, he received messages on July 19th from Bernadette's Instagram account. These messages, which police believe were sent by Sarah, directly contradicted Bernadette's diary.
They said she had lied about the abuse.
Precisely, claiming she'd lied about the abuse allegations against Scott. So the goal was twofold: reinforce the runaway lie, and more importantly, retroactively destroy the clear motive for murder.
But this is where the human element comes in, because the friend, Warren Naylor, he didn't believe it.
He was immediately suspicious, and that suspicion from a friend is powerful evidence. The way the messages were written, the timing, the content, it just didn't sound like the girl he knew.
And that suspicion was presented in court.
It was. It further eroded the defendant's already weak story. It showed that these messages were clumsy, poorly executed fakes designed only to protect Scott Walker.
And the final nail in the coffin for the runaway story came from that lockup garage.
Yes. When police searched the garage in Walton, they found Bernadette's personal things.
What did they find?
They found her rucksack. And critically, they found the diary. The diary containing that explosive entry from July 16th detailing the abuse, and Sarah's threats.
Finding her essential belongings, a rucksack and a diary, in a location linked to Scott,
Yeah.
a location he lied about visiting. That's the proof she didn't run away.
It's undeniable. If you run away, you take your bag, you take your diary. Instead, Scott had taken those items from the scene of the crime and stored them, trying to hide them. It proved he was responsible for her disappearance and, by extension, her death.
So the combined weight of all this evidence, the digital data, the 9-minute conspiracy call, the fake messages, the physical items from the garage, it became irrefutable.
It was. And it led to their arrests on September 14th, 2020, for both murder and perverting the course of justice.
And despite not having a body, the police were confident. They believed they had a complete prosecutable case.
And they were right. It was a successful prosecution built almost entirely on reconstructing events and proving the overwhelming motive and the criminal behavior that followed.
So that leads us to the trial and the legal consequences. It all started at Cambridge Crown Court in June of 2021. For you listening, what is the fundamental challenge in prosecuting a murder case when there are no physical remains?
Well, the burden of proof is exactly the same. It has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. But you have to prove the elements of the crime differently.
Right.
Normally, the body proves the corpus delicti, the fact that a crime even happened, and the cause of death. Without a body, the prosecution has to rely on overwhelming circumstantial evidence.
Things like the motive, the last sighting.
Exactly. Motive, opportunity, the logistics of disposal, and the defendant's own actions. You have to use all of that to prove conclusively that the victim is dead and that the defendant is the one who killed her.
And in this case, with the diary and the mobile phone blackout, they had that conclusive evidence.
They did. The verdicts came back relatively quickly. Scott Walker was found guilty of murder and perverting the course of justice on July 26, 2021.
And his sentence, handed down in September, was exceptionally harsh.
He received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 32 years. And that is a very, very significant minimum tariff. It reflects the aggravating factors of the crime, a murder committed to silence a victim of sexual abuse.
And while Scott was convicted of the murder, Sarah Walker's legal fate was separate. She was found guilty only of perverting the course of justice.
Yes, and the court made a very careful distinction there. Sarah was found guilty because her actions, delaying the report, faking messages, supporting Scott's lies, were all intentional efforts to derail the police investigation.
And her sentence.
She was sentenced to 6 years in prison. It's important to see that separation. The court found no evidence she was directly involved in the physical act of murder, but she was entirely complicit in the criminal conspiracy to hide it.
What really stands out in the records from the trial, though, maybe even more than the verdicts, is Scott Walker's absolute refusal to say where Bernadette's body was.
He kept that control right to the very end.
A calculated, final act of malice.
It is, and it's a common feature in these nobody convictions. The killer denies the family that one piece of information they need for closure, and this was addressed directly by the trial judge, Justice McGowan. Her comments were intentionally scathing and became part of the judicial record.
What did the judge say about his silence?
She spoke very powerfully about the trauma that this refusal causes. She stated unequivocally that Scott's silence meant Bernadette can't be shown the respect she deserves.
So the judge was recognizing the victim's right to a dignified burial, a final resting place.
And the denial of that right by the killer. She also acknowledged the wider psychological harm this was inflicting, saying that this ongoing cruelty meant some family and friends would go on hoping she might be alive and might someday come back into their lives.
That statement just perfectly captures why withholding the location of a body is seen as an ongoing part of the crime itself.
And if we connect this judicial outrage to the law, we have to talk about Helen's law.
Right.
It was highly relevant to the length of Scott's sentence. This law was a direct response to cases exactly like this one, where killers exploit that loophole of silence.
Okay, let's look at Helen's law in more detail. The official name is the Prisoner's Disclosure of Information About Victims Act 2020. What was the story behind this legislation?
It was championed by a woman named Marie McCourt. Her daughter, Helen McCourt, was murdered back in 1988, and her body was also never found.
So she campaigned for this change.
For decades. The law was finally passed in November 2020, and its core intent is to create a legal mechanism to pressure convicted murderers to reveal where their victims' remains are. It tries to put the needs of the families seeking closure first.
So it doesn't actually force a killer to talk, but it changes the calculation for their time in prison. How does it work?
It acts as an aggravating factor at sentencing. Specifically, when a judge is deciding the minimum term someone must serve before they can even be considered for parole. The law says the parole board must take into account a killer's deliberate failure to disclose this information.
So in Scott Walker's case, his refusal would have been a factor in that 32-year minimum.
Absolutely. While the main reason for such a long sentence was the nature of the murder itself, killing a child who was a victim of abuse, his refusal to comply with this moral, and now legal, expectation of disclosure would have solidified that lengthy minimum term.
It's a legal tool designed to combat that final, controlling act of cruelty we saw from Scott Walker. It acknowledges that denying a family a body is a continuous punishment.
Precisely. It shifts the burden. If you want to be considered for release, you need to show remorse and cooperation, and that now includes providing information for closure. Scott Walker was sentenced under the shadow of this new law, ensuring his silence had real consequences.
So moving to the aftermath of the trial, even with the convictions, the search for Bernadette didn't stop. The fundamental, unresolved tragedy is that she is still missing.
That's right. The sources confirm the Cambridgeshire Constabulary mounted huge, sophisticated searches for weeks after the conviction. These were massive operations.
What do they involve?
They used specialized search dogs, dive teams for rivers and lakes, and drones to survey large, difficult areas of terrain around Peterborough in places like Gunthorpe and Newborough.
But even with all that technology and all that effort, nothing was ever found.
Nothing. Her remains were never located, and it leaves the family in this perpetually unresolved state. Detective Justine Jenkins, she summed up the official police position after the trial, and she articulated this lingering uncertainty perfectly.
What was the police's final summary of the case?
She said, "We may never know the truth about what Scott did and why, but we do know Bernadette had made allegations of abuse against him."
And that quote is a really powerful summary of the outcome.
It is. It affirms the absolute truth of the motive and the crime, getting justice for Bernadette, but it also admits the investigative reality. The complete physical truth of how the crime was carried out remains locked away with the perpetrator.
And that silence, unfortunately, became permanent just a few years later.
Yes. Scott Walker died in prison. He died at HM Prison, Full Sutton, on December 22nd, 2023.
He'd only served 26 months of his sentence.
Just 26 months of his 32-year minimum. He was 53 years old. The cause of death was complications from bladder cancer, which had metastasized throughout his body.
And he took the secret of Bernadette's location to his grave.
He did.
Now, there's a strange bureaucratic detail that emerged well after his death in mid-2025. It involves the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman.
Right. This finding by the PPO, it's an administrative footnote to the case, really, but it gives you some insight into how the prison system operates, even with these high-profile cases. The PPO investigates all deaths in custody.
What do they find?
They found that staff at the prison, Full Sutton, had failed in their duty to complete paperwork in a timely manner.
What was this paperwork for?
It was the paperwork needed to start a review into whether Scott Walker might be eligible for compassionate release because his health was failing so rapidly from the cancer.
So he might have been released.
Well, the finding noted that given how serious his crime was and how little time he'd served, compassionate release was highly unlikely to have been granted anyway. But the fact remains, the internal process itself was flawed.
So even though the outcome probably wouldn't have changed, it highlights a lapse in procedure for managing severely ill prisoners, even one as notorious as Scott Walker.
Precisely. It shows that these internal systems can fail, and it requires external oversight from the PPO to maintain standards. But, ultimately, this administrative detail is just completely overshadowed by the core, lingering tragedy.
Which is that Bernadette's body is still missing. Scott Walker is dead, but the police file technically remains open regarding the location of her remains, and her family is left in this perpetual limbo.
Yes. The system succeeded in proving the murder and punishing the guilty parties. But that final act of control, withholding the body, was maintained by the killer until his death. The legal closure is complete, but the human closure is forever denied.
So what does this whole analysis mean for you, the listener, and for our understanding of criminal justice today? This case is a powerful example of the system achieving justice under the most difficult circumstances.
It is a nobody conviction secured through just an outstanding use of mobile phone data, establishing clear motive from a victim's own writings, and methodically breaking down a coordinated family cover-up.
It shows how resilient modern investigative techniques can be against deliberate criminal deception.
But it also, and this is the painful part, it demonstrates the limits of that justice. Scott Walker kept his silence, and his death protected that secret forever. He managed to inflict one final, lasting cruelty on Bernadette and her family by denying them the knowledge of where she lies.
That denial of respect, the prevention of proper mourning, that is the profound, enduring wound of this case. It's a reminder that while we can legally resolve guilt and impose a punishment, the law often can't compel the essential human element that's needed for true closure.
And it raises an important question for all of us to consider. In the context of laws like Helen's Law, is the system doing enough to account for that continuous emotional damage that a perpetrator's silence inflicts?
Because even with the legal punishment secured, the victim's memory is tied forever to some unmarked, unknown location.
And that is a profound lack of respect shown to the deceased. It's a failure that the legal system, for all its power, couldn't fix.
A deeply sobering analysis of a very difficult case. Thank you for walking us through the specifics of the investigation and the legal framework.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening.